Hello, welcome back to the David Watson podcast. Have you ever wanted to have three young children and go traveling around the world, but you're going to go to the Amazon and live with some of the most remote tribes and villages that exist? That's exactly what this next guest did. I hope you enjoy the episode. Hello, welcome to the David Watson podcast. I think we just did a very good job of starting because we were about to go off on a tangent as we were just briefly catching up. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you.
So, I guess my first question before we get into everything is where did this journey begin for you, or how did it begin?
Absolutely. You're probably thinking, what journey? I trained as a vet, but actually very recently, and what I'm here to talk about today, very recently, I went on an 18-month adventure living in the Amazon rainforest and living in Africa with my three small children to learn about health in different communities. Um, Little bit more background about myself. I trained as a veterinary surgeon. I then worked in veterinary practice, and then in healthcare consultancy before that. But fundamentally, I've always been really interested in how health and disease works and how we can set up bodies that don't fail.
Hmm. So how did it? But what happened that made you think I need to do this?
We'd always thought we were going to take a year off at some point, and there's always a reason not to, right? There's never a
Yeah,
perfect time. And then one day, my third child was about 6 months old, and I said to my partner, "You know what? If we're going to go away, maybe it should be pretty soon." And then it did take about 9 months of planning because all of the
it's still
travel.
pretty soon when you've got three kids.
It felt quite soon. That last month, I just remember waking up, having nightmares about snake bites, about parasites, about diseases. How were we going to keep the children safe? And every morning, my husband was having the same nightmares. We'd wake up and we'd say, right, what was yours about? Okay, snake bite. Right, what are the levels of precaution we're going to take? Okay, we need to make sure that we've got the boots, we're teaching them the right behaviors. So you step up onto logs and then you step down the other
Yeah,
side, so you don't step over in case a snake comes out and grabs you in an
yeah,
ankle. And then we also thought, okay, should we be taking medication with us? We looked at anti-venom, and actually anti-venom's really bad because you get anaphylaxis in 1 in 5 people who take it, and it's really unstable,
yeah,
especially in hot climates, which is where we were going to be. So we ended up reading scientific papers, and we found this a lot of interest in a chemical that used to be was developed for cancer, and they found it didn't work in cancer, but actually is showing real promise in treating snake bite because snakes put a certain type of toxin that this molecule deals with. So there's good evidence on safety, and there's evidence in mice for effectiveness, and it's being tested in humans. So we ended up writing to the research company and saying, can we buy some of it? And they said, no, are you mad? And then we ended up writing to a molecules manufacturer, so a company that actually makes the molecules, showing them the molecule and saying, can you make this for us? Can we have enough for 5 doses? And we got that. So just from the
that's
nightmares,
crazy.
you ended up like planning and planning and planning. So I think we had 5 levels of snake protection when we traveled in the end.
What's a couple of things that struck me is one for 99.9% of people, as soon as they have children, that ambition stops until the children are left home or they've retired.
Hmm.
And it's like you did because it probably isn't the hardest time to do it. It probably is the best time to do it when kids are young and they're not settled and they have no routines and habits and they're much more adaptable. But in terms of adults, it's like the easiest time to raise children is when you're settled, you know where you are, and you have a stable job.
Hmm.
Not let's wander off into the abyss, which is effectively it's just no matter how much you research it, it's the unknown. But and the reason I mention that is because every single fear that you and your husband discussed when you woke up in the morning is probably every single objection friends and family put at you.
Yeah,
And
it's
then you're like,
pretty
yeah,
pretty
yeah,
rare.
no, no, you're absolutely right. Because normally I will sit and die on a hill because my defense is staunch and I believe it's true. Not, no, I think you're absolutely right, and I'm shitting myself about that happening as well. It's not a good argument. It's not the if that was my defense lawyer, I'd be like, oh, no, I'm going down for life.
It's such a good point. I think in our
It's a
jobs
good job
we
you missed that point.
well, it is really tricky because there are very many very good objections, and actually it's quite hard to articulate where we saw the benefits because we certainly thought there would be benefits for our learning. Obviously, we were very curious. For adventure, we I've never actually done anything like that before. I really had barely travelled, but I had this feeling that I wanted to learn more. But I also, having adventures like really strengthens the group. And so I did
Mm,
want to have the opportunity to spend a lot of time with my children when we were young and like solving problems together. Because yeah, we had, there were so many challenges and things that you never even think about, like weird parasites or,
yeah,
what do you do about shoes when you're in the middle of nowhere and there are so many things to solve. But we're lucky in our jobs. We are something called innovation consultants. So people ask us to solve problems for them. So
yeah.
actually, we've had a lot of practice. And so when these problems came up, rather than thinking, oh gosh, there's nothing we can do, it's like, right, how do you reduce the risk? What are these steps that we can take? Because we really believed that there was good that could come
I,
out of
I,
it.
I actually think you and your husband were 100% spot on, and it's exactly the right time to do it. It's just, Jesus, I'm about to use such a wokeism. It's such a social construct to this is how we're going to have children. This is how we're going to do what I mean? Because one of the things that you and I were getting close to talking about before we started recording is you don't have to go back that in terms of human evolution to a point where that is exactly how we lived as families and as groups. We just moved around. And whilst there would have been known areas and territories, because of many different events that could have happened, you would have traveled to unknown areas all the time. It
Mhm,
was just, there was no concept of this is where I live. Uh,
mhm. We actually saw that really firsthand when we were in the Amazon. So we stayed in Guyana. And we were in these villages where everything was one story. So everything is really low. You have these small houses in which you have a sleeping area, but all the kitchen stuff is outside because if it's 33 degrees and 100% humidity, why would you possibly cook
Yeah,
inside? So homes look very different. But actually one of the fascinating things is it's only in the last couple of generations when people have had homes like that at all. And the homes and the villages are constructs that have been created, almost imposed upon the communities
yeah,
because of the need for education or because of the governmental drive for schools. Because if you're nomadic, your children aren't at school and they're learning very different things. But in increasingly globalized worlds, the governments take um, constructs from the West primarily.
yeah,
And so, for good reasons, education has been imposed and created, but it has completely changed how people live, even to the extent, David, where the houses were built in ways that could never last because there was no history of engineering for years because why would
yeah.
you live somewhere and you move. And so that was fascinating because you're like, right, we've imposed a construct around how people live, but their intrinsic knowledge is at odds with that.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
It is because I think one of the things that people often complain about education and that there's all these conspiracy theories, some of which may be true, that it was because of industrialization you were taught just to just recite and not think for yourself. But that's no different because at no point was anybody taught to think for themselves. You were taught by somebody who was older than you, more experienced with you.
Mhm,
This is how you do it, because if you do it the other way, you're going to get,
mhm,
something's going to go wrong. So we've kind of always had
mhm,
this concept of listen and learn, or demonstrate and learn. I'll teach you
mhm,
my experience so that you can gain your own. But the main purpose of school originally really was so that everybody had a basic level of reading and writing. So you could just
Hmm.
communicate wherever you went in the world. It kind of wasn't this, not necessarily this big idea that um, you will be controlled. It was actually freedom because
Mm-hmm.
up until we taught reading and writing to everybody, you just need to believe what I said if I appeared to be able to read.
Hmm.
I must be smarter and better than you because I can read and you can't.
Hmm.
It, but it
Yeah,
kind of
fascinating.
evolved from that into where we are today, with nobody ever
Mm,
really challenging, does it suit what it, do you know what I mean? Like the reason we originally
mm,
had schools was to just teach this very basic ability to communicate.
that is a really interesting one because the children went to 8 schools while we were traveling, so just local village schools, and it was very interesting to see the kind of very colonial education systems,
Yeah,
especially when we were in Africa. You know, you'd look at the materials and, it would talk about snowmen, and you're thinking, Tanzania, this is Tanzania. How relevant is this? But, it was a lot of rote learning. We saw a lot of corporal punishment, and corporal punishment also, I didn't realize, but hasn't really been documented prior to colonialism, so that you really saw kind of firsthand the industrialization of education and the echoes right down the years because
yeah,
the schools were very different. But then when the children went back to UK schools, which they found very easy, everyone said, "Are they going to adjust?" I will tell you, they spent 18 months adjusting. And coming to the UK school, it's a very easy, a very
mm,
easy experience after that. But then you do also see, with all of the extra resources that UK schools have, and the screens and the huge amounts of materials and the games and all of that, you sort of then see the structure of education as we believe in it today still underneath it all. And I
yeah.
don't think I'd quite appreciated it until I'd seen it really pared away in some of the village schools we were at.
How do they? How do they? Because I will probably I'm 50, so I remember corporal punishment at school. Never
Hmm.
really received it. I remember seeing my brother get hit with a ruler
Hmm.
and was completely fine with it. I was raised with a dad that would use a leather belt, completely
Hmm.
fine with it.
Hmm.
It's and I've often struggled when I look at children today and I have see adults negotiating with children.
Hmm.
But and I'm not saying that my education, my the way that I was raised was better.
Hmm.
I'm just saying when I see an adult trying to negotiate with a child to behave in a
Hmm.
classroom, I like
Hmm.
that's the tail wagging the dog. And,
Hmm.
and there was a difference, which I recognized as a child. There was a difference between a teacher that was issuing punishment and a teacher that was
Hmm.
angry. They were two
Hmm.
very different punishments. One
Hmm.
was a teacher that was actually objectively, no, you've been warned, you've been told, you've disobeyed. The other
Hmm.
was, I'm having a bad time in my life
Hmm.
and I can vent this frustration. Do you do I mean? So
Hmm.
away from the schools, when you were in
Hmm.
these villages, how did they punish children? Because it's a very,
Hmm.
I imagine it's an unforgiving environment. So we're not taking
Yeah.
chances.
So you'd think that, and I was expecting that too. But it was what was a real shock in the Amerindian villages, especially. I never saw an angry person.
Yeah.
I never saw anger. And the other thing, even further, when I had an 18-month-old child and she would cry a lot. When things were wrong, she would cry and she would scream. And this was really tricky and it was very embarrassing. So imagine I'm in my hammock. It's dawn, but there are still lots of mosquitoes. I fed my baby for a long time and I said, look, I stop. I need a break. I pass it to my husband and she cries and she cries and she cries and he's soothing her and he's trying to play games with her. People would bring porridge for her because they assumed that the only reason a child would be crying to that extent would be if they were starving.
Yeah.
I called it shame porridge, David. It was mortifying. I was like, why are these babies not crying? You
Mm.
know, the parents are not angry. I'm not seeing crying. And then it was actually very interesting watching the children because in order to punish, you need to have a view of what that child should do and what
Yeah.
that child
Yeah.
should do. But actually, they just seem to have a whole range of different techniques they used and a whole lot less kind of fears about what would go wrong. So they had a lot of storytelling. So for example, there was the Dai, there was the Kanaima, some of these kind of monsters. If you were loud in the forest, the monster would come and steal you. Right? You don't actually, then you have the kids and you actually have the adults too, very, very worried about these things. So you would be told, shh, 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 listen, this will come. And you're like, okay. And so there was a lot of storytelling, which then drove kids to behave because
Yeah.
the adults clearly behaved as well. The children had a lot more freedom in the day, so they were able to, at break times, they would be out around the village. They would be, even my own kids. I'd speak to people that I'd met in the village, and they'd say, "Oh, I met your daughter. She was around playing with the kittens," or "Oh, your son was climbing the tree, climbing our fruit tree with his friends." And you think, "Oh gosh, the children." The village was seen as a very safe environment. So the kids were kind of out, and if something was wrong, an adult would tell them. But the kids they also seemed to listen really well, presumably because people didn't really talk to them that much.
Yeah.
It wasn't a lot. There was not a lot of words to process, so they'd do what they were told because there were lots of options, and it wasn't. Yeah, they either obeyed because they were scared of a story, or they took guidance because it was never imposed. But I naively thought the reason these kids are behaving is because they must be beaten at home, and I never saw any
Mm.
signs of it. But it seems to start so young. But then I realized that the whole social environment was very, very different in ways that it's actually quite hard to imagine as a
Yeah.
Western parent.
It reminds me when I was a child. I think it was in 1980. We were living in. My dad was in the army, and we were
Mhm,
posted from Ettrick in North Yorkshire to
mhm,
Cyprus, and we were placed at this place called Berengaria, shortened to BG, and it was a compound. All the houses were there. Had a primary school, had the church, had the doctors, like a medical centre. It had the NAFI, it had supermarkets. Like I said, the school, it had swimming pools, everything like that. But it was fenced in. There was only one
mhm,
entrance in and one entrance out. We started
mhm,
school at 7 o'clock in the morning. We finished at 12.
mhm,
And basically, once you got home and got out your school uniform, you were free. Parents did not care. Don't do what you want because they knew you couldn't leave the compound because
mhm,
the only way in or out was through the main gate. And
mhm,
I, yeah, you just came home, had your lunch, and that was it. Then really, until somebody, for whatever reason, you had to go home.
mhm,
And that would be in sometime in the evening, but it'd be the same at weekends. You would just be free to do whatever you wanted because we were nobody ever stopped you leaving the compound. But one, you didn't need to,
mhm,
and two, if you did, the military police on the gate would know that you'd left. And as soon as they
mhm,
seen your parent or your parent, has anybody seen David and Christopher? It's like, yeah, yeah, they
mhm.
went down there, or they'd ask you
Yeah.
where you were going, what you were doing. And it was this, like you say, there's this strange freedom that
Mm.
that we had as kids for this like 2.5 years that we lived in Cyprus.
It's really interesting how that sort of unsupervised time also
Mm.
shapes how children behave, and I think that is something that we really have lost, or it's very
Yeah.
hard to provide in this environment because you need kids to learn how to solve problems when there's not someone immediately there.
Mm.
But also, I don't know whether you found this, but certainly you have kids that are going around, but as soon as there are adults doing something, kids they want to
Yeah.
see. They're like oh, suddenly, so and so's fixing an engine. Fascinating.
Yeah.
So and so's planting cassava. Oh, I'll go and help because maybe I'll get a little bit, maybe I'll get a cassava to take home for my mum. The
Mhm.
sort of suddenly everything, the adults are the children are wanting to know what the adults are doing. They're wanting to be involved because it's quite cool, but also because they haven't got other things pulling them in different directions. So having that time to roam also seems to help them, I think, look for adults and learn from adults.
I had this theory that the one thing that we'll never get back because of the internet is boredom. And what I mean by the boredom is because people get bored on the internet, but it doesn't stimulate their curiosity. They just kind of keep scrolling, and it seems to develop frustration. Whereas when I was a kid, and I'm assuming because you were nodding your head that you remember life before the internet, boredom meant I was prepared to go on a 5 mile hike to go and discover something because there was some rumor in the village that there was, I don't know, maybe a tin box that had been left up from a car accident or something. We had nothing else to do. So
Hmm.
that's why things like Meccano sets, Lego sets, Airfix, and that's why if I wanted to know something, I was excited to go to the library because I could only go on a Saturday and I could only go if
Hmm.
my parents took me in. So 2 hours in the library, drawing out books and reading some of them. And if I had a list of books, well, maybe if I read these first while I'm in the library, get the information I need, then I can take these ones out and bring them home. But it was
Hmm.
boredom that pushed curiosity. It was literally the seed that drove it forward. And I think that's one of those things that was probably going on when you're in these remote places. You have to
Yeah.
find something to distract you. So you become
Mm.
curious about the environment around you. Is like when again, and I don't want it to come across as criticism of children or anything like that, but when I see them, every 5 people in a room staring at a screen, bearing in mind, I'm developing a product so that somebody can stare at it on a screen. So I understand the hypocrisy, but
Hmm.
we didn't have that. 5 people in the room staring at the floor caused people to have fights. So,
Mm.
they went stir crazy. So it's like, let's go out. And you were happy to go for a walk for no other reason than I've got nothing else to do.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, it was very interesting that we basically saw no toys for
Yeah.
18 months. And when I was getting ready to leave, so many people said to me, "Oh, what toys are you taking?" And
Yeah.
I thought, "Oh, I haven't even considered taking toys. I'm gonna have to carry this stuff." Like, toys are so far down my
Yeah.
priority list. And I ended up giving in and I picked three tiny little plastic figures. I can't remember. I think there was a Hulk and a lion
Yeah.
and something else. Put those in, and they never came out because there's so much of the world that's really interesting. And I think again for people growing up in our society, it's very hard for them to imagine what life looks like
Yeah.
for children without toys. But it is complex, it is rich, it is there's no toys are really fun to keep children still in a room. But actually, if your house only has, a couple of hammocks in it, why would you be inside? Toys are just not a thing.
No.
And so that's,
Serve no
that's another
purpose.
thing. We sort of direct kids' attention. We're like, oh, you should be playing with those toys. That's your role and responsibility. Whereas, I remember watching, 4-year-olds light fires, and you're like, oh, that's great. Or,
Yeah.
a toddler. I saw a toddler catch a fish.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
My goodness.
But I remember doing things when we were in Cyprus. We were 5 when I went, and 7 when I left. One of our favourite things was catching lizards and chameleons and
Yeah,
stuff like that.
yeah.
But now my brother remembers this really well. I don't because my brother's older than me. We used to catch snakes. Do you know how many
Yeah.
venomous snakes are in Cyprus?
No.
No, I don't remember any of them being venomous. Apparently, most of them were. But we
Yeah.
just somehow learned as kids. And my brother was telling me they used to have these monsoon drains. We were talking about. We were watching old clips on YouTube, and it doesn't.
Hmm.
The village doesn't exist anymore. So, but like people before it fell apart went in there and filmed
Hmm.
it. And there's these monsoon drains. Obviously, when it rains, you get the raining season. And my brother said as soon as it rained, we used to go down to the end where it used to spill out of the village, apparently. And all the snakes would come out and he said we used to catch the snakes. It's just like,
Yeah.
remember? And it was right opposite our garden, apparently, because we lived towards the bottom of the village. Can you
So
imagine that?
when we were
5-year-olds
in
catching venomous snakes.
Well, it's funny. It's really funny you say that
Yeah.
because my when we left, my middle child was 4, and I remember in Tanzania. So we've got this great big expanse of beach. We're very far north on an island close to Zanzibar. It's a very remote little village, about I don't know a mile away. But otherwise, it's completely deserted. And there are these crabs called ghost crabs. They're the fastest crabs on land, I think. They are really fast, and they were captivating to the kids. Every day though, we'd hear screams down from the waterside, and then one of them would come running up with a crab attached somewhere on their hands. And we said, you know what? They're gonna learn. Crabs pinch, they're gonna learn. But they did learn, David, but they didn't learn what I thought they were gonna learn. They just got better. They didn't
Yeah,
stop because
no,
it was so satisfying to catch them. They
yeah,
just got faster. And so, yes, they got pinched less frequently. But then, next place we're in, big wall covered in lizards, and their reflexes were so
yeah,
fast. They were grabbing the lizards. So then they were coming back holding the lizards. And the lizards looked about as surprised as we did, because, they just don't expect kids to move that fast. And then the next place, dragonflies. So they started being able to grab the dragonflies out of the air because they trained their reflexes. And, we talk so much about fine motor skills in children and the
yeah.
importance of learning to write and playing with diddy toys. But animals, learning to gently catch animals in a way that you don't get hurt and the animal doesn't get hurt,
It's a
that's
skill.
what kids are grown up doing.
Yeah, but it's an incredible. Can you like? Because you just said something fascinating about a dragonfly. Can you imagine being able to grab a dragonfly out of thin air without hurting it? Do you know what I mean?
The
I
first
can.
time he did it, we thought the dragonfly was injured. And then we're like, no, it's just flown away. And then he was just,
Yeah, because that's like that Mr. Miyagi scene with the chopstick catching flies. And your 5-year-old son just got that one,
yeah,
got that one. You know,
yeah.
it's phenomenal, and all it's. But I find one of the things, and you and I were talking about this just before we started, is I, I I am fascinated as we were talking about cholesterol and dementia, and I am fascinated by where bone density is going to go in children because of sugar and not no activity. When I was a kid, the only thing you knew how to do was run around. There wasn't
Hmm.
anything to do. There was just nothing else to do except run about.
Hmm.
And we're already starting to see children with weak bone structures,
Hmm.
and I wonder how much of it is just related to high sugar content.
Hmm.
And I do think that has become an unspoken epidemic in children, and not just that energy drinks, just monster drinks and stuff like that. You just like, and I'm a guy with a coffee machine behind me who I limit
Hmm.
myself to 2 coffees a day. Um,
Mm.
but when I see kids like 13, 14 drinking energy drinks and already showing all the signs that they can't get up in the morning, and it's not because they're
Hmm.
teenagers, because their just adrenal system is overloaded with every stimulant going.
Hmm.
It's versus what you saw traveling, where I guess there's no monster drinks, there's no Red Bulls, there's no.
So it's interesting what you say, because in the last few decades, everywhere we went is now subjected to a lot of sugar. And it's actually very
Yes.
interesting because you can see the effects of just changing the sugar piece. Because what you're alluding to, David, is that there are so many pieces of how we live now, which are very different. Yes, we've got the
Yeah.
movement piece, we've got the kind of diet microbiome piece, we've got the sugar piece, we've got all of these things. And actually, it's quite hard to understand, this, you mentioned sleep, is it the light? Is it the screens? Is it the sugar? Is it the caffeine? There are so many elements. But actually, in a lot of these villages, you could see the effect just of sugar because they still have lives which are very movement based, very
Yeah.
active, lots of farming, lots of fishing, etc. And so that was really curious. For example, when we were in the Amerindian villages, we could see that hypertension and type 2 diabetes had rocketed, but also uterine fibroids, which is one thing that at the moment we go, oh, this is an ethnic problem. But if something is going up with two other things and you've got a very substantial environmental influence, I'm pretty sure that in the next couple of
Yeah.
decades, we're suddenly going to be like, oh, hang on a moment, there's a thing we're missing here. So yes, I would certainly agree. And if we take it back to the osteoporosis, the bone strength piece that you mentioned, we know that sugar consumption has plays a significant role in osteoporosis. But also, it's about about how the bones form and the thickness of both the outside of the bone and the little kind
Yeah.
of bridges within the bone. Those are formed very, very early on in life. And so that first 2 to 5 years is critical. Every time before puberty is really important because you can still make gains. But in general, the earlier we have an effect, the stronger those bones are. So, David, if I ask you to imagine, if you just think of a person with a hip fracture, okay,
Yeah.
tell me about what is that person you're imagining in your mind?
Well, I work, my predominant job is people with head injuries. So I've worked with lots of people because of car accidents and stuff like that.
Mm.
But I know where you're going because it's not because they were walking, that they had
Mm,
like serious life-threatening changing injuries.
yeah. So you're seeing a population of people with hip fracture who have had a significant impact.
Yes.
The other group is the kind of person who is maybe 80 and
Yeah.
typically more often female. She falls, she fractures her hip. And then you're thinking, oh, right, okay, so maybe in those previous 10 years, if she'd done more movement, she'd be in a better place. But then you can think earlier and you can think, okay, so what would need to have been different as a child? And then you're thinking, running, jumping, all of those. But what's really cool is actually if you think even earlier, the age at which a child walks determines the angle of the top of their hip. So
Okay.
babies that walk earlier have a hip head angle that is less likely to break in adulthood, which is really cool because it alludes to exactly what you're saying. How do we create bones that don't fracture when a
Yeah.
person's 80 by thinking about it when they're 8 months? And in a lot of traditional cultures, they've got all sorts of ways to try and encourage kids to walk earlier because having a baby that needs to be carried is a big cost on the mother and all of the other
Yeah.
Allah parents, all the other parents who interact with that baby. So you want to have a baby that's walking. As soon as they can walk, they've got a degree of being able to move themselves around. They can join in with another child group. And so the only toy we saw in Tanzania was this kind of spindly tricycle thing, which basically didn't have a saddle but had two handlebars and some wheels, because that helped the kids to walk.
Yeah.
But it's not just that. A lot of African cultures have kind of massaging and walking exercises. So they are trying to get the babies to walk as early as possible. And then you're like, oh my goodness, so these things that they're doing are protecting them decades in the future. Just mind blowing.
Well, because one of the things that, and I didn't become, it's only because of head injuries and trying to do rehabilitation with people that I kind of learned more about this, and it was really just my own mindset. Um, but one of the things I look at when I was a child versus now is because we were always moving, we must have had a really high functioning lymphatic system
Hmm.
because of just all the running around, all of that oxygenating of the muscles. And for people that don't understand, if you want to see muscles deteriorate, starve them of oxygen. Which is why endurance athletes always go on about CO2 max levels, because it's just your capacity of your lungs. But when you start running and you consistently run and move and vigorous exercise, you get this combination of oxygenation of the blood, which stimulates everything from the top of your head down to your toenails. But you have a
Hmm.
high functioning lymphatic system. And especially like when I was a kid, because we didn't really drink much in the way of soft drinks, it just wasn't so readily available. So you're always drinking water, which is hydrating. So everything is continuously cleaned out over a cycle. Whereas now, again, and I sound like that grumpy old man, some truth in that, but I now look at people taking incredibly toxic drinks for hydration, which actually dehydrate you, and you're not moving. So it's never it's- people go on about they regulate so much about heart and blood without but rarely talk about the lymphatic system, which is the one that actually removes the toxins from your body. And it's
Hmm.
just like you have to move. And it's kind of that another example that we evolved as moving objects, not sedentary. You know, it's just
Mm.
like we're not
Well, so
tortoises.
one thing I find really interesting is that So I was not a particularly active child. I was certainly not very strong, I wasn't very coordinated. And as a teenager, I then did a lot of sport. And since then, I've always kind of moved quite a lot. And so I build muscle and I maintain muscle fine. But if I don't use it, if I don't do something with it, I lose strength really quickly. And I compare myself to a friend of mine who when she was a child, she lived opposite a play park and she spent hours of her life on the monkey bars, on the rings, and her upper body strength is phenomenal. So she can not do a pull up for years, and then she just does a pull
Hmm.
up because she's built the right neural circuit. So
Yeah,
her brain's very confident she can do a pull up. But she also, in that critical period of muscle development when she was really young, she's trained muscles that continue to function at a high level. And I think that's one of the things when I look at kids today, I think, oh, if you did a bit more movement now, then when you are 25 and you're wanting to bulk up, you're going to find it much easier. When you're 45 and you're trying to prevent muscle loss, you're going to find it a lot easier. So there's so much kind of paying into the bank in early years that is
yeah.
really
I've
important.
always been naturally strong for my size, and I haven't lifted any weights for a few months.
Mhm,
I don't know. I don't know why, without getting into conspiracy theories, but the last few years I've had more injuries in the last few years than I've ever had in a lifetime. And when I say
mhm,
injuries, I don't mean like the times I've torn my leg open, smashed my head open. I mean just body parts, just like pulling muscles
mhm,
and stuff. And Mm. and a couple of years ago, I hadn't been able to lift any weights for a good year. And just because I was curious, I went outside, very little warming up, and just like I'll see what I could deadlift. I still managed to lift 175 kilos, which is
mm,
only about 30 kilos off my 35 kilos off my personal best. And I
mm,
probably hadn't done a deadlift for 2 years, and I had
mm,
no kind of you know, but my stamina
mm,
can take months to build up.
mhm,
Never had,
mm,
even as a child. I guess
mhm,
I had a lot, but not compared. I was always more strong than I had stamina, and I was always a good
mhm,
sprinter, never a great long distance runner. I remember
mhm,
it was only my nieces would have been 13 because she's 14 now, so it was sometime last year. She come for a walk with me with the dog. She's in trainers, and I've got Wellington boots on, and she thought it'd be funny.
mhm.
I bet I can out. I bet I'm faster than you. And
Yeah.
she realised in about 10 meters how much slower she was than me. But the bit I pointed out to her was after 25 meters, I couldn't go any further. But that
Yeah.
initial speed that I had at my
Mm,
best 100 meters still existed. I just couldn't run. I
mm,
mean, after 25 meters, it was just like, actually, I might need a moment before I can start walking again. But that initial explosive speed still existed,
mm.
which surprised me because I
Yeah.
thought I'm really going to struggle. But no, I was
Yeah.
still actually like, I surprised myself.
Yeah. It's so important to have that kind of movement-rich childhood, especially even earlier than we even think about babies
Yeah.
moving. Really sets them up well.
So how have you kind of gone from veterinary to where you are now?
So I spent 4 years in veterinary practice and I enjoyed it, but it is it can be a challenging place to work. There's a lot of unhappiness in the profession.
Yeah.
There's a lot of risk of litigation. In comparison to other degrees where you have a lot of training and a lot of debt, salaries are quite low. And it was a place where I felt not only bored quite a lot of the time, but also very stressed because you never know what's going to come through the door. And so I decided that I wanted to do something different. And so that was the point where I started looking at completely new careers. And I found this one, which is why I started working here. And when I speak to the people that I work with, the clients, they sort of say, well, we're interested in human health. So what can a vet bring to it? But I think vets and doctors see things very differently around
Yeah.
health. So as vets, we're very used to looking at animals that exist within systems that are very different from what they've evolved for. You know, if we're thinking about dogs and dog health, if we're thinking about cattle, if we're thinking about pigs, you know, we recognize that
Well,
we're keeping them in very unnatural environments.
can
But
I
I
just
think
say
doctors
something?
often lose that perspective
Well, can
because
I?
they,
Because
they
I
don't
don't mean
realize
to
how.
cut you. I don't want to cut you off. But a vet will tell you, stop giving your dog shit food. You're treating your dog badly. A doctor won't say that to a human.
Yeah,
Do you mean a vet will tell an owner
yeah.
of a pet off for you've let them get overweight? You're spoiling
Mhm.
them. You're not taking them for a walk. And a doctor will just give you type 2 diabetes tablets.
Yeah, I do think there is quite a big difference, and I think your point's absolutely valid, David.
Yeah,
It
sorry,
does
because I didn't want
mean
to
that
cut you off,
you
but it's just
no, you're absolutely right. But you know, it comes down to so many things. You know, if you look in the science, there's a lot about why humans are, you know, like particular in the mammal kingdom in that they are poorly evolved, or you know, they are kind of set up to fail, or processes that should work just don't work with humans. So things like birth, things like, you know, back pain, all of these things are seen to be like deficiencies in the human body.
mm,
But as a vet, I just don't buy it
no.
because I'm like, why is it just humans? Why are we really that arrogant to think that we've managed to survive when we're clearly not built for it? I just tend to think, no, oh, what are we doing wrong about how we keep humans?
No, because it's true. Because people like it's funny how, and you know, like I said, I have to be. I try to be mindful because I don't want to sort of be disrespectful for people. But you might be a doctor, you might be a professor, you might be highly educated, and you'll put forward this argument that humans were poorly designed, yet we dominate the planet. So it makes no sense. You can't be the most dominant species on the planet and be flawed in your design. Because one of the most overlooked aspects of our evolution was how we learned to our ability to cooperate with each other.
Hmm.
It's fundamentally. I can't remember the name of the author, but the book was about Homo sapiens, and
Is it Sapiens?
yeah, it could be sapiens.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he was talking about if you look at primates, we're the only primate species will share resources. All of the others they
Hmm.
might hunt together, but
Hmm.
once it comes to here's the food, the dominant male comes in and he wants his share and he'll take it away from the group if he
Hmm.
wants to. And if you don't like it, you're going to have to fight him for it. Whereas I might recognize that you haven't got any food and I'll be like, ah, I'll share you a bit of mine. With this kind
Hmm.
of strange, we developed this understanding that if I cooperate with you like that, very much like when you were in the village and somebody's telling you they met your child because your child turned up and just went into the house to play with the kittens,
Hmm.
they're like, yeah, but that's what we do because we cooperate.
Hmm. Yeah. I think there's a sort of odd, you know, contradiction where we think, ah, the human body is going to be fine no matter what we do with it, and that's the diet and the movement and all of that.
Yeah.
Oh, we'll be fine. But then also, oh, the human body is poorly evolved. And I just these two things are really contradictory, but people don't seem to recognize just how at odds they
But
are.
it is, isn't it? Because, like, so, go back to the vet analogy. A vet will look at an animal and tell you why the diet is wrong because that's not
Hmm.
how the dog evolved. It's not how the cat evolved.
Hmm.
But then they'll sit there with their own Monster Energy drink. And I'm not slagging off Monster Energy drinks or Red Bull or anything. And then say, course, I'm feeling really stressed today. Yeah, no shit. You've just drank a liter of stimulant, which you weren't evolved while giving a lecture to somebody about how that animal wasn't evolved to eat like that and live like that. And you're like,
Yeah.
the blindness is so frustrating. And it comes back to this thing I've mentioned on the podcast before. There was a study that I read last year, and it was last year or the year before. I read it last year, but it was for 2022. And the study was
Mhm.
originally done in 1972. And they're like,
Mhm.
right, here's 50 years later. And they went to various supermarkets, and effectively, it was something like 72% of all food was fresh and would be considered either was ingredients for to make a meal. and
Hmm.
none of it could be for more than a few days. And
Hmm.
the remaining 28%, no, it was 78%, that was it, and 22% would be considered processed. But it
Hmm.
didn't, in fairness, the study didn't highlight what process meant in 1972. So could that, it could have been a can of peas,
Hmm.
which technically would still be, what we
Hmm.
would consider fresh food. And it said that in 2022, when they did the same study, it was 78% processed, 22% fresh food for
Hmm.
ingredients. And that 78% processed with ready meals, food that could last, well past dates. And they said it's just the complete opposite because
Hmm.
everybody in 1972 expected to go shopping every other day for fresh ingredients. Today, we put stuff in the cupboard that won't go out of date for a month, 2 months.
Hmm.
And she's just like, wow. And every time I read, I should probably get a life, but every time I read some study about this chemical is carcinogenic, but if we
Hmm.
put it in low enough volume, we don't consider it carcinogenic for food. It's only carcinogenic if it's a liter of it. But if it's a little micro bit, it's like, really? Because I'm sure those micro bits over a lifetime add up to an awful like a liter of highly toxic poison chemicals that we shouldn't have.
Hmm. I found it really interesting when we were away because I certainly saw firsthand how long it takes if you have no refrigerator and all your food is fresh. The process of getting food and cooking food over an open fire, it takes a lot of time.
Yeah.
And I also was really interested because we talked to a lot of kids because obviously if you have kids, you always have other people's kids as well, or your kids are
Yes.
away with other people's kids, but you get a lot of exposure. And in the UK, if you're talking to a kid, the easiest thing to start with is what's your favorite food, right? Every kid has got an answer. I tried that when we were away and I got some really strange looks. The children would be like,
Yeah.
it was clearly an idea that just hadn't really occurred to them because if food is not very predictable, you eat what you have, you're happy with whatever is there. You don't really have a choice because it depends what you can find or
Yeah.
that idea of being selective around food. I almost never met a picky eater. And I remember talking with one parent, in the Tanzanian cloud forest, looking out over this amazing view. And she says, "Oh, my child is fussy." And I was like, brilliant. I haven't met anyone else who's even talked about this. So I was like, "Oh, tell me." And she said, "Oh, my daughter, she will only eat beans, rice, and fruit." And I thought,
Yeah.
God, that's not a fussy kid in the UK. But it was interesting because she clearly had seen it. She felt her child was more selective than most children. But if your food environment is good, it doesn't really matter how fussy you are. And if your food environment is unpredictable, you're not going to be fussy in the first place. And so then I came back and I thought, oh, let's have a look in the literature. What is the evidence around picky eating? And to my surprise, everything I found said, children have this sort of prevalence of picky eating that's between 30 and 50%. And I was like, what? And even in different cultures, I was thinking, how is it then that I never met one in these
Yeah.
more traditional places, which obviously are much less studied? And then I finally found one paper in Japan where they were looking at how Japanese nursery schools feed children. And they made a comment, picky eating wasn't observed because picky eating isn't tolerated. And I was like, oh,
Yeah.
there we have it.
That's because when you were saying that, my mum's mum popped into my head. And now, if you can imagine, my nan is Irish, grew up in Ireland, and she passed away in 1986. But I'm sure I think she was born in 1919 in Ireland, Southern Ireland, on a homestead. It's just what I mean. You can imagine if you said to my nan, I don't like that food. There was two things that were happening. You would be getting a very sore ear, and don't worry, you can eat tomorrow.
Yeah, yeah,
Not, I'll make you something else. It's like, oh, you think you're not hungry? We'll see how you are for breakfast tomorrow. And this could be 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but you turn down something she'd put on the table. Well, that's fine. You don't eat for the rest of the day. Enjoy going to bed hungry.
yeah. Well,
So,
it seems really obvious, doesn't it, when you say it, but it's very counter to kind of parenting advice now in this country.
Yeah, because I think I've seen that Japanese study. I think I've seen it. I think I've seen a short documentary on it. They just don't tolerate this idea of being
Right.
over, and it's
Yeah,
that oh you're not hungry. Okay, because the funny thing is, I think it was a vet that taught me this. When I had a cat that used to live indoors when I was up in London. They were just, I
mm,
said, oh, she's a picky eater. Remove the bowl. She'll eat tomorrow when
yeah,
she's hungry. And
yeah, yeah, yeah,
that's literally what I did. But that reminded me as you were talking, that's exactly what my nan was like. If you,
yeah,
oh, I don't want that. You didn't eat. That was the end of the
yeah.
story.
So we had to think very hard, obviously, about taking three kids into the jungle. We ate all sorts of bizarre stuff. We ate a lot of bugs. We ate some really rotten saltfish stew. I remember it vividly. But the kids had to eat everything because if there was not food, they would starve. And so we thought about
Yeah,
that, from when they were very small. We set up a food environment where we had two rules. You never need to finish anything on your plate. But if your plate's not empty, there's no food, there's no extra food, and you put some of everything on the plate. And actually, when that happens, then we never force them to eat. They know they'll get more food tomorrow, but we're also not going to give more of what they want because
yeah,
that's not how food works. And so despite having a child who is at very high risk of selective eating, which is one of the reasons we thought very hard about it, we travelled without any problems. The kids ate absolutely everything because they had that kind of belief system. But I would say it's one of the biggest barriers that parents who are thinking about taking their children travelling or going on adventures with, a child who is a selective eater enormously restricts that family's possibilities.
yeah.
And so it's just one of the reasons why picky eating is really important to set children up not to be picky eaters because it's hard to fix it. But just that ability to be flexible, it's really hard.
And also, I think and this goes in both directions. If your child is sat there with a picky eater and sees a picky eater say, I don't like that, they're like, "Hmm, maybe I don't like it." Whereas when you're in a
Yeah,
village with salty fish, stewed, disgusting, rampantly stenchy fish, and they're like, all the other kids are tucking in, "Oh, maybe I'll tuck in, as it's the only thing I'm going to
yeah,
eat today." You know, but if you say
yeah.
to, if I put something healthy down in front of a child and they're like, I don't want that, I want the ketchup and chicken nuggets. And I'm like, oh.
Mhm.
Well, the other child's going to be like, I want chicken nuggets and ketchup. What
Yeah,
else can I say no to?
yeah.
You know, it's crazy.
Yeah, I think when one of my daughter came home recently, she said, Mum, most of the children at school say they don't like vegetables. And I paused and waited. She said, but what do they eat?
It's mad,
She
isn't
was
it?
genuinely curious.
But it is. I think I seen something the other day of what the skills we've lost in the last two generations.
Interesting.
Because when I grew up, almost everybody, definitely three generations ago, pretty much everybody had some form of allotment. You know,
Hmm.
if you lived rurally, everybody
Hmm.
was eggs. Everybody went to a local butcher. Um,
Hmm.
Carcasses hanging up. It was just the norm. And now there is
Hmm.
that thing where kids don't know where meat comes from,
Hmm.
and you're just like, oh. And they're all saying they're vegan whilst
Hmm.
eating constituted factory-made chicken nuggets, not realizing,
Hmm.
well, actually, you kind of eating meat. You just nobody's told you that's a chicken is meat,
Hmm.
and you just this kind of miseducation, I guess.
Hmm.
You know,
Yeah,
that's
it
that.
is really difficult.
So just how can why should everybody come and find you?
Because they should come and find me if they're interested in understanding how some tiny little tweaks in early childhood could deliver enormous long-term benefits for the children in the future.
And what is the service that you provide?
So at the moment, I have a podcast myself. I also have I write articles on Substack, and I have a book with a literary agent, which might answer some questions, but a lot of it is freely available.
What's the book?
The book is called Growing Up Weird. Weird stands for Western Educated, Industrialized, Rich and Democratic, which is a very catchy term that some psychologists use to define cultures like
Yeah.
ours, US, Western Europe. So it's about looking at how how our culture shapes how we grow and develop, and what we can learn from more traditional cultures to do some small changes early on to help us avoid that kind of normal Western trajectory of health.
And where can they find you?
So we're still finding a publisher, so it's not yet available. But if I'll pass on my Substack links,
Yeah.
and you can share those in the show notes.
Okay. Are you self-publishing as well?
No, because I've got interest from publishers at the moment,
Okay.
but it's
Yeah.
something that I would consider.
Okay. And lastly, and there's no purpose to this question other than I like asking it. Using your imagination, imagine you have a time machine. The machine
Mhm.
itself is a car. What car would you travel in? Where in history would you go and why? And what music would be on the radio?
Oh, that is interesting, especially the music piece, because I actually never listen to music. But the
You can have
car
a
that I would
podcast if
pick,
you want.
sorry,
You can have
a
whatever you want to
podcast.
listen to. Yeah.
Mm, the car that I would pick, I really like small spaces. So house is small, car is small. I'd pick an old small VW Polo, which is my first car,
Yeah.
and I would travel to the same Amerindian communities that I visited now, and I would look at what their cultures were like when they remained nomadic, because that idea just blows my mind. And I wouldn't have to go very far back either.
No, no, probably only 30 or 40 years.
And you're going to ask me about music or podcasts. My life is very silent. It's mostly my own internal
So just
internal
white
monologue.
noise.
It is, yeah, I like listening to the sounds around me. So actually, I don't think I'd have anything playing at all.
So you just turn the radio off.
Yeah.
That's brilliant. Thank you very
Yeah.
much. And there you go. Life advice that can come in strange forms. But it's funny, we were talking about the vet scenario and how vets look at animals differently, but doctors don't treat humans like animals that evolve from an environment. And it's definitely difficult in the world we live in. All of the advice, it's mind-boggling, and everybody says they're right. But what we do know for definite, we didn't seem to have as many of the health problems that we have today. So we must be doing something wrong with our environment. And please do check out all of the links to all of the information. It will be in the description. And thank you very much for watching. Thank you for the support, the comments, the likes, and for sharing. And wherever you're from, whatever you believe, please do take care and be blessed. Thank you.